Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, to the Byline Times podcast. This time, the tax status of Akshata Murthy, wife of the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who enjoys non-domicile tax status, which means she doesn't pay the same taxes as the rest of us. Being a non-dom means Akshata Murthy only pays tax on what she earns in the UK on the basis that this isn't her permanent home, even though she is resident at number 11 Downing Street. Is that illegal? No. Is it immoral or unethical? Well, you can make up your own minds. Already I can hear some people saying, isn't this a bit Victorian, or at least a bit 1980s, to be asking questions about a politician's wife who, after all, hasn't put herself up for election or demanded the glare of publicity? That's certainly a line that's been trotted out by Conservative MPs, essentially saying there's nothing to see here. Now, normally, we at Byline Times would agree, except that, according to the ministerial code, ministers must provide a full list in writing of all financial interests, including those of their spouse or partner, that might be thought to give rise to a conflict of interest. Now, if the man who sets tax policy for the country, having a missus who legally avoids paying tax because of rules he's responsible for, isn't a potential conflict of interest, it's hard to know what is. We'll hear shortly from Sam Bright, the investigations editor for Byline Times. But I'd love to hear from you too as well, if you're listening live on Byline Radio. If you want to do that, you do have to be listening on your phone. This doesn't work on iPad or laptop or PC or whatever. You have to be listening on your phone. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a microphone icon. Tap that. That requests access, and as long as I haven't previously barred you for saying something daft or rude, then we'll let you on. So I'd like to get as many voices as we possibly can on this. And just a reminder as well, before we get cracking, that Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast come from the Byline Times, and we're not answerable to any proprietor, to any corporate interest, to any oligarch. There is nobody pulling our strings because we are funded by ordinary people like you. So please take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's a brilliant monthly newspaper edited by Harvey, but you don't only get your Byline Times newspaper if you take out a subscription. You're also helping to fund Byline Radio, the Byline Times podcast, Byline TV, and our wonderful news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. And that's where you'll find details of how to subscribe at bylinetimes.com. Let's welcome Sam Bright to the conversation now, Sam. And Sam, there are a few layers to this story. I've tried to explain as best I can what a non-dom is. It doesn't mean that you avoid paying tax altogether, but because this is not regarded as your primary home, it does mean that you only pay tax on what you earn in the UK, and overseas earnings are paid in tax overseas. That can have significant tax advantages for somebody like Akshata Murthy.
Yeah, exactly. And we know the fact that her father is an Indian billionaire businessman, and Miss Murthy, she owns considerable shares in companies based in India, and so she will derive a lot of her income from those shares, which means that they won't be domestically taxed. They won't be taxed in the UK using UK income tax laws or dividends, however she may be paid. So we do know that she derives considerable financial benefit from this, and in turn, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak does as well. There's obviously been scandal recently about her shareholding in this firm called Infosys, which is a technology firm based in India, which until last week maintained an office in Moscow. So she'd been criticised for the fact that this company was continuing to essentially tacitly endorse Putin's regime by not removing its business from the country, or at least not be seen to oppose it in any meaningful way. And Rishi Sunak compared his predicament, their predicament, to the Will Smith incident at the Oscars, where Will Smith decided to slap Kevin Hart for criticising his wife. And he's people have tried to use that argument. Again, you referenced, Adrian, that Boris Johnson said this, James Cleverly said this, that it's allegedly Victorian to be talking about someone's wife. But we're talking about, hundreds of millions of pounds in shareholding that's been taxed differently to how we would be taxed. And as you say, the Chancellor's the one setting the rules. And thirdly, the most crucial thing, which you led the show on, the ministerial code, which requires government ministers to declare the financial interests of their spouse or their partner, and to avoid exactly this sort of thing, where there is a potential conflict of interest between the minister's government role and the financial interests of them or their close family members.
I've been looking at the ministerial code today, and I've also been looking at the register of MPs' interests. And although Rishi Sunak is responsible for setting tax policy in this country, and his wife benefits from non-domicile tax status, as far as I can see, there is no reference to his wife's position there.
No, exactly, there isn't. And Sunak controversially uses a mechanism that is called a blind trust arrangement, whereby he doesn't have to declare his own personal financial interests. So he's very reticent about any sort of commercial declaration that might cause him some problems in the newspaper. I think I'm right in saying the only interest that he declares from his wife is in Catamaran Ventures, which is a venture capital firm, which we revealed a couple of weeks ago had ties to a Russian billionaire whose fortune had been assisted by a now sanctioned Russian oligarch who had close connections to the Kremlin in the past. So even on that front, even on the one small thing that Rishi Sunak has declared on his register of interests, even that gives cause for concern. And I think if he declared the full remit of what he and his wife are up to financially, I'm sure there'll be plenty more stories in the press, to be honest.
Yeah, and part of Akshata Murthy's defence is that she has no choice but to be non-domiciled. That specifically is not true, is it?
No, well, lots of people listening to this will have seen the tweet from Richard, well, the tweet thread, I should say, from Richard Murphy, who's a tax expert, this morning, which basically sets out why Akshata Murthy's denial is wrong, is erroneous. And that's primarily because you have to request non-dom status. You don't automatically receive non-dom status if you're a citizen of another country or if you have dual citizenship, which is what the government's trying to imply. It's trying to imply the fact that she is a non-dom because she is a citizen of India, and therefore all citizens of India are non-doms. That is not the case. You have to request it. But the thing is, you also have to prove the fact that you are domiciled in a foreign country, that is your primary home, or that you intend to return there. And people have been asking, considering the fact that Sunak and his wife live in London, in 11 Downing Street, their children attend schools in this country, they have business interests here. Infamously, in the past couple of days, it's been revealed that they donated a sizable sum to Sunak's former school. People have been suggesting that an inquiry should be opened up into whether his wife is still a non-dom. So this story may have legs yet.
Again, I mean, the key point out of this is that whether or not she's an Indian citizen, that in itself does not grant you non-domicile status in tax law. So you could be a citizen of another country, but still live and work in the UK and pay all of your tax on your earned income in the UK. There's no automatic link between being an Indian citizen and having non-domiciled status. Richard Murphy makes the point that being an Indian citizen might be part of your argument to HMRC, to Revenue and Customs, that you should be treated as non-domiciled. But in a sense, you have to make your case. So saying, yes, I'm an Indian citizen in itself wouldn't clinch it, but it may be part of it. Another part of it might be to say that you have a permanent home in another country. So in her case, people might think, well, reasonably enough, then she has a permanent home perhaps in India. But as far as we can tell, she has 3 homes in the United Kingdom, 1 home in the United States, which has been described as a holiday home. So again, there's something there that is at least questionable and that Richard Murphy believes would justify deeper investigation by HMRC.
Yeah, exactly. And this really shows where the conflict of interest arises, because, you know, who's in charge? Who's in charge of the nation's economy in this whole process? And that's Rishi Sunak. He's the boss of the British economy, and yet his family members are seemingly benefiting from a process, or at least not being investigated from a tax benefit point of view. And so, I mean, politically, it's interesting how he's going to manage to get himself out of this hole. Does he preempt further scrutiny and say, yes, I'm going to open an investigation into my own wife? I mean, that seems highly implausible that he would do that. Is he going to say, well, I'm going to declare more interests on the MPs, the ministerial register of interests? Again, I think that would, as I said, I think that would fuel the story rather than quash it. And so I think he's driven into a position where he has to double down, and he has to try and distract in any way possible from this story, whilst potentially being hammered by opposition parties for potentially financially benefiting both he and his wife from a situation that he's in charge of, essentially.
Yeah, let's just explore a little bit more. I know you've written about this as well, Sam, for Byline Times. People go and check out your article at bylinetimes.com about the relationship between a company in which she was heavily invested called Infosys and Putin's Russia.
Yes. So, as I said previously, Infosys is an IT firm that operates primarily in India. It was founded by Rishi Sunak's father-in-law. Rishi Sunak's wife holds shares worth, it's believed, some £700 million in this company. And it's retained its presence in Moscow, even during the Ukraine crisis. And under the PR pressure of these stories, only last week announced that it was withdrawing from Russia. And lots of people have criticised India's relationship with Putin and the fact that they haven't followed through on the sanctions that have been imposed by the wider West. And this potentially fits into that general pattern. There's also another Indian firm, which Sunak's wife is invested in, called Udaan, which is another technology company, and that has received considerable investment from a man called Yuri Milner, who is a Russian billionaire. He's big on the Silicon Valley tech scene. As we know, as you just mentioned, Adrian, Sunak and his wife own a property in California, and now Yuri Milner gained much of his wealth thanks to the oligarch by the name of Alisher Usmanov, who's an Uzbekistan-born metals magnate. Now, Usmanov, who's now been sanctioned by much of the West, he's got a close relationship with Vladimir Putin. So Milner, who's invested in the company that Sunak's wife has also invested in, essentially gained his fortune thanks to someone who had close ties to the Kremlin, which again raises certain, perhaps not conflict of interest concerns, because Usmanov has little to do with Milner and Udan, the company in question now, but more in terms of the awkwardness of the perception of all this and exactly how Rishi Sunak is declaring his conflicts of interest, because these sort of connections are not stipulated at all by the Chancellor in the ministerial register of interests, and it's up to journalists like you and I to go and search them out when, as you said, he is explicitly required to declare things that may give rise to conflicts of interest between his government activities and the commercial interests of himself and his family members.
Yeah, Akshata Murthy's spokeswoman has said that she pays all the tax that she is legally required to in Britain. And we should make it clear, there is no question about that. That is not the debate. It's whether she is entitled to non-domiciled status and whether that is appropriate for the wife of a Chancellor of the Exchequer, and whether the Chancellor of the Exchequer ought to be declaring that in a much more transparent way than is the case in this instance. That's really where the debate lies. And I suppose there's a bigger question here, Sam, and you've touched on it there with the talk of these companies operating in Russia, even at a time of international sanctions, and only disengaging when the fierce glare of publicity is upon them. And it's this sense of this tiny elite of super rich people surfing global economies, making money wherever in the world that they can, moving money around entirely legally from one domain to another and avoiding the harshest tax regimes. There is something that will grate, I think, with many ordinary listeners who are facing, as we are here in the UK, national insurance rises, cost of living increases at the moment, at the idea that there is this tiny, tiny group of very wealthy and very powerful people who aren't being seen to pay the same dues as the rest of us.
Yeah, and combined with that, the fact that they're in charge of the country, they're supposed to be the people's representatives. And like you say, who do they actually represent? They represent the oligarchy, supposedly the sort of people who we're now supposed to be punishing. I mean, there are a lot of parallels with the people who've bought up property in London for the past couple of decades, who've invested heavily in the City of London. Of course, Parliament's Intelligence and Security Commission, Intelligence and Security Committee, called it Londongrad because of the influence of Russian oligarchs in the capital in recent years. They've managed to launder their reputations, and they've managed to ensure that they retain as much of their money as possible, much of which has been gained at the behest of Vladimir Putin and his regime. And you see these sort of people, or at least this sort of mentality, now at the top of the Conservative Party and at the heart of our government. People who have extraordinary amounts of wealth. I mean, Rishi Sunak's estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and his wife potentially richer than the Queen. These are people who represent the 0.001%, not even the 1%, not the 10%, not the 50%, not the 40% who voted for them, but, a slither of the population. And essentially, these are people as well who've put in place fundraising mechanisms so that their political influence and the success and fortune, both political and financial, of the Conservative Party is ensured, for years. So, the Conservative Party, as we know, is accepting millions from Russian millionaires since Boris Johnson took over as Prime Minister. It is a party that functions on donations from millionaires and billionaires and those who own corporate entities that do traverse the world and, do take advantage of loopholes where they exist. And there just seems to be a fundamental question there as to whether, I mean, it's a matter for the British population, and the British population have voted for the Conservative Party. But there is a fundamental political question here as to whether the Conservative Party can claim to represent the interests of the entire British population when it is funded by such a narrow elite, and its politicians are very much embedded within that.
I'm Adrian Goldberg. He is Sam Bright. You are listening to Byline Radio. If you're listening live, or you might be listening to the catch-up on the Byline Times podcast. Just a reminder that our work on the radio and on the podcast is supported by subscriptions to the Byline Times, funded by ordinary people like you. So if you do take out a subscription, which we'd heartily recommend, you can read plenty more by Sam and loads of other great writers. You get a brilliant monthly newspaper, the Byline Times, but you also help support our work on Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast. And you'll get details on how to subscribe at our website, bylinetimes.com, which has loads of new stories every day as well. Probing, investigative, asking questions of power, doing the proper job of journalists and answerable to no one. As I say, you can find out more, take out a subscription at bylinetimes.com. There's a bit of a historical resonance to this, Sam. People may remember the comedian Jimmy Carr. And there was a bit of a scandal, wasn't there, about his tax affairs and entirely legal tax avoidance. Previous Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron said Jimmy Carr's actions were morally wrong. And as I said right at the start, people can make up their own minds as they're listening to this, whether Rishi Sunak's wife is doing anything morally wrong or whether she's entirely entitled to do what she's doing. But I think that's where a lot of the animus around this story rests.
Yeah, exactly. It's the real moral hypocrisy of the whole thing, and this idea as well that it's one rule for us and one rule for them, which really I think stems back to not stems back to, but it's been amplified by the Partygate story. The fact that during the pandemic, Boris Johnson and Downing Street advisors partied while the rest of the country locked down. And in this case, many people will see that they have to pay taxes. They work hard and pay their taxes in this country. Why are those at the top of the tree, linked to ministers, in some cases, ex-ministers themselves, current ministers, why are they not paying their fair share? And then even before that, even before the Partygate stuff kicked off, you'd got the scandal just prior to Christmas about MP second jobs. We almost forget about that now. The fact that, this was known for years that MPs took second jobs, but it was blown into the public consciousness that MPs were earning ludicrous, and still are earning ludicrous amounts of money as part-time consultants for private firms, operating their own law practices. There's the big scandal involving former Attorney General Geoffrey Cox, who consulted on behalf of a Caribbean island, I forget exactly which, but which in itself is a tax haven, which again just strikes to the heart of this current issue. The fact that politicians are really milking their position and their status to not serve the interests of the people they represent, but to serve their own bank accounts. And people just see that as deplorable, especially in the context of the expenses scandal now over a decade ago. It just seems to be one sort of kick in the teeth after another for the British public that is told year in, year out, they've got to be thrifty. Austerity came, you've got to tighten your belts. We're all in this together, the Conservatives said. And now this year, it's the cost of living crisis, it's the war in Ukraine. We've got to make sacrifices to tackle Putin's war effort. We'll all suffer, but we'll make it out because we're a great nation. And yet, again, it's only the majority that are suffering, but not the minority at the top. And I think it's really politically dangerous, to be honest with you, Adrian, because I think these sort of stories, when they keep coming, when they keep battering people, the relentlessness of the corruption and the scandals. I think it genuinely radicalizes people. I think it makes people think. It makes people apathetic, which is dangerous for one, because it lets the abusers back into power again and again. But it also turns them towards more radical ideas and towards, revolutionary concepts, dangerous revolutionary concepts. We may need a revolution, in a positive way to change some of these processes. But there's plenty of revolutions that people believe in that may be hugely dangerous to this country, and that's what fundamentally is at stake. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, you have that growing anger of the population, which is never healthy in a democracy.
Yeah, it makes people feel disillusioned, not with just individual politicians, but with the idea of democracy itself, which clears the way for authoritarian rule, doesn't it? But a strong leadership that will clean up all the mess. Often, in fact, always, that proves to be illusory, but it can be attractive to some people at times of crisis. And one of the reasons why Trump was successful in the United States, one of the reasons why somebody like Orban has been successful in obtaining and maintaining power in Hungary, and many people would argue it's also part of the appeal of Boris Johnson. And what's intriguing about non-dom as well, this status that you have, and again, people might say that there is a reasonable basis for accepting that some people might be working temporarily in the United Kingdom, but whose homes are in another part of the world. I think we can all recognise that as a real life scenario, and who therefore, sure, for a short period of time, may be entitled to earn money in the UK for which they pay tax in the UK, but whose other income in other parts of the world should not be taxed in the UK, because those people in the long term are not using British services over and above those which they pay for through their existing taxation. But there are people like the former Conservative Deputy Chair, Lord Ashcroft, who I think was a long-time resident of Belize. You've got the Daily Mail proprietor, Lord Rothermere. And I think that many people would look at this and say, not that we should scrap non-dom rules, but the rules should only apply to people who really are temporarily involved in the UK and who do not have any significant influence on our public life. If you want that and you want to be seen as one of us, fine. You're welcome from wherever in the world you may be. But you have to pay for that. And part of the membership fee, many people would argue, is to pay taxes on everything that you earn and pay that tax in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's plenty of ways in which the rule should be tightened. I think that, there's reasonable scepticism as to whether the Conservative Party will ever enact those sorts of changes. For one now, because it's sort of a recognition that they were misbehaving, Sunak and his wife, like you say, not unlawfully, but potentially, some will say that they behaved immorally. And if the Conservative Party changed the rules now, they're sort of admitting that perhaps they shouldn't have done that. It's also the case, as I've mentioned, that the Conservative Party is funded by people who, have a great deal of money and ship that money from one jurisdiction to the next in order to pay as little tax as possible. And so you can imagine if they tightened up the rules on non-doms, that they'd be getting quite a few phone calls from donors saying that their credit cards now being revoked. So it is a potential problem for the Conservative Party in what they do about this.
I'm listening to you, Sam, though, because the irony is the amount of money that you need to earn in order to legally avoid paying tax in the UK on this basis is phenomenal. You have to pay to have non-domicile status now, and the fee for enjoying non-domicile status ranges from £30,000 to £60,000. So Britain does now, it didn't used to, I think this is from 2017, I'll stand to be corrected on that, but you didn't used to have to pay a fee to be regarded as non-domiciled. And obviously politicians recognised that there were people who were abusing the system, people who were taking advantage of it and who were perhaps not contributing as much to the UK exchequer as they should be or as they could be. So they introduced a fee, and it depends on how long you're resident in the UK as a non-dom. So your fee, I think, is £30,000 or £60,000 to join that club. How much money do you need to earn to make it worthwhile to pay £60,000 in, as it were, a voluntary tax? Well, not a voluntary tax, but to pay £60,000 to avoid paying the tax you would otherwise pay if all of your earnings were taxed here in the UK. I didn't earn £30,000 last year, much less pay a £30,000 membership fee to be non-dom.
Exactly. The return on investment must be absolutely wild. And, you know, like you say, this is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is his and his wife's personal financial interests, you know, which potentially due to the system that's in place in the UK, they're earning, I mean, safe to assume maybe 10 times that figure is a reasonable return on investment, 5 times that figure, so £300,000, £600,000. Even that, we're not even reaching into the millions at that stage. Even that's a vast amount of money. You know, more than the overwhelming majority of people pay in this country. Earn in this country and paying taxes in this country. Like these sums. Even despite the coronavirus pandemic, when we've been used to hearing billions and millions bandied about, even that on a personal level is a vast amount of money for two people.
Yeah. I'm quoting here from The Guardian, and they cite a study by the London School of Economics and the University of Warwick, and they found that 2/5 of people who earned £5 million or more in 2018 had claimed non-dom status at some point since 1997. So 40% of people who'd earned £5 million or more over the previous 2 decades had at some point claimed non-dom status. And they say it includes famous actors, directors, movie producers, Premier League footballers. 22% of top earning bankers as well have benefited from the scheme. I think there's a bigger philosophical point here, Sam, that I'm really interested to know if any of our listeners have any thoughts on this. And I've grown up with this as you have, this notion of there's another penny on the income tax and all this notion that taxation is bad. Now, of course, none of us likes, at some level, none of us likes paying out any more money than we want to. But do I resent paying taxes? No, I don't. Do I embrace living in a society in which someone, when they are ill, can go and get treatment at a hospital free of charge? Yes, I do embrace that. Do I want to live in a society where there are trains that run in the evening that might not be particularly full, but which ferry people who maybe are doing low-paid jobs to and from their place of work or places of entertainment? Do I want to live in a society where the roads are well maintained and not full of potholes, as they are currently in Birmingham, where I live? And the answer to all these questions is yes. And how do we get these things in society? We get these things through taxation, and we put all of our money into the pot. And then we, because we're very privileged to live in some form of functioning democracy, can also get to say who the people who spend that money on our behalf should be. And if we don't like them, we can kick them out. That's a huge privilege. And you realise what a privilege it is when you see what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. But there's a whole narrative, and it's, I have to say, embraced by most of the mainstream parties in this country, that we want to keep tax down, that tax is a bad thing. Tax is a good thing. It has to be usefully and purposefully spent. But let's say here and now, taxation is a good thing, and many of the things that we value in our society, from education, universal education, free healthcare at the point of use, modes of transport, street lighting, these things come from taxation. And if we didn't have taxation, we would live in a far less habitable country, one that wasn't properly policed, one where fires were not put out when they took hold. Taxation's really good. There, I've said it.
Radical, Adrian. Blimey neck. It would be donning your red beret before we know it and leading the revolution. And for one, I look forward to it. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's a great problem in this country in that you sort of have rampant capitalism, which adds to the costs of people's living expenses, which then makes them really nervous about tax increases, and probably justifiably. I mean, for example, I unfortunately live in London, where renting a property is prohibitive. So any increases on the cost of energy down here will push even more people into poverty than already are in poverty in London. You know, greater percentage than anywhere else in the country are in poverty in London, primarily because housing is so expensive. You know, wages are higher here in London by an extraordinary amount versus the rest of the country. But the fact is that housing costs are high to such an extent that it's pushed millions of children and adults, many of whom are in work, the adult size, into poverty, and that's a ludicrous situation. If we're seeing this in the energy crisis. We're seeing energy firms profiting to the tune of billions, while ordinary people are scraping around for the next meal. And so there's something fundamentally wrong there in the way that capitalism is regulated and governed in this country, which therefore, as a result, makes higher taxation a lot less palatable to people. I mean, you can imagine a situation in which the national insurance contributions went up, not at a time when there's an energy crisis, and perhaps when economic growth was strong. And I'm sure there'd be little objection to that whatsoever. But it's the fact that this comes... it compounds everything else that people are suffering economically, that really, I think, pushes people towards an economically conservative mindset.
Yeah, well, again, I think we've been conditioned, haven't we, to believe that low taxation is a good thing. I mean, this is the narrative of global corporations. But I say to you here and now, Sam, that taxation is the oxygen of the welfare state. Take away taxation, reduce taxation, the welfare safety net on which virtually all of us, I'm excluding that 1% of oligarchs, virtually all of us rely on some or all of that welfare state safety net at some point in our lives, whether it encompasses the NHS, whether it's about education, whether it's about policing, just the fabric, the glue that holds society together. Anyway, I've ranted enough, Sam, and I've taken up enough of your time. It's been really brilliant to speak to you, and I hope for people listening, this has been a really good and full introduction. I heard on the normally brilliant Radio 4 PM programme, the normally brilliant Evan Davis, asking the question, does it matter that the Chancellor's wife is a non-dom? I hope we've answered that question comprehensively. Yes, I was disappointed to hear that question being asked, quite honestly, and I think there are better ways to frame it, and I think we've comprehensively proved that it does matter and that it should be a matter of concern for our political classes. One final question, Sam, before I go. Accepting, of course, it matters, and we've demonstrated why it matters. Is there also an argument here that there are people on the Tory right, or maybe even on the Tory left, I don't know, but people close to Boris Johnson perhaps, who are out to get Rishi Sunak, people who perhaps see him as a potential rival to Boris Johnson and who have decided by perhaps leaking this information, I don't know what the original source is, but who've decided that he needs to be either brought down or at least taken down a peg or two?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a lot of ill feeling towards Sunak within the Conservative Party, among Johnson allies who I think blame the Treasury to some extent for the leaks of information around Partygate. And like you say, on the right of the party, those who are opposed to any new tax increases, and particularly the national insurance hike, as they call it. So he's got to watch his back, Sunak, politically, for sure. I'd say that he's left himself wide open to this sort of attack by not holding his and his family's affairs to the highest possible standards. I just see it as politically baffling why, as soon as he took over as Chancellor, he didn't get all of this in order, and why he wasn't really diligent about making sure that no one could accuse him of this sort of thing. And that's an act of political stupidity, and he's been punished for it, frankly. So he does, politically speaking, he does have a good degree of culpability himself as well.
I don't think this is a story that's going to disappear anytime soon. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. That's Sam Bright, the investigations editor at Byline Times. You can read some brilliant stuff on this by Sam at our website, bylinetimes.com, and also by our political and Westminster correspondent, Adam Bienkoff, as well, who's written a very piercing article about the situation engulfing Rishi Sunak at the moment. What can you do? Well, you can take out a subscription to the Byline Times. Check out our website, bylinetimes.com, and that'll tell you how to take out a subscription and where you can go. It's only 39 quid a year, for God's sake. And you get a brilliant monthly newspaper, the Byline Times, and you're helping to fund Byline Radio and Byline Times podcast, which is where Byline Radio ends up after it has been live. Please spread the word far and wide if you can. We don't have a marketing budget, so anything you can do to let people know that we are here and that we have these kind of in-depth, intelligent debates. I know, rare, isn't it? Please do spread the word. In the meantime, thank you very much indeed for listening. It's been great to have you along with us at Byline Radio. I'm Adrian Goldberg. I'll see you soon.